Hello, good morning, good afternoon. For me, it's morning. I think a lot of you know that I'm based in Boulder, Colorado, and it's a beautiful morning here, and especially a great day to talk about data-driven sustainable ingredients. I'm really glad that our panelists today went along with my idea to call this a show and tell of impact, because that's what we're going to do today. We have panelists from across the supply chain, and they each have a story about how they are using data to track and improve their impact. I'm very excited about today's session. We have some behind the scenes looks. Anyways, we'll get into it very soon. But at the beginning, I definitely want to give a big shout out to our webinar sponsor for the whole year, WPA. It's been awesome to have their support for our webinars. So as people are trickling in, let me just run through our agenda today. I have some welcome and announcements. If you're new to PSC, don't worry, I will tell you what we're all about quickly. And then we have three sort of lightning round talks from our panelists, someone from ADM, InnovaFeed, and Pulse Canada. And then after we go through those lightning round talks, we will have a chance for Q&A. So as you're thinking of questions, as you're listening to our panelists, please jot them down or drop them into the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will address those at the end. So again, if you are new or if you are a member, welcome. We're so happy to have you. We are the Pet Sustainability Coalition. I am Allison Reeser, the Director of Sustainability and Innovation here. We're a nonprofit based out of Boulder, Colorado, as I said, but we have global membership. So around the world and across the supply chain, companies join us, and we support with any sort of environmental or social strategy. We do that in a couple of different ways. One, we support companies one-on-one. You can think of us like project consultants for you. And then two, we really facilitate collaboration and coalition building for those bigger problems that one company can't solve on their own. We see this industry transformation happening in the pet industry, especially in ingredients, in packaging, and responsible business. So if you are interested in joining as a member or learning more, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. You are actively in our 2025 webinar series. As you know, today we're going to be talking about data, but we have some really exciting ones coming up in several weeks. So at the end of July, we have one all about third-party certification. We have a pretty stacked panelist, one of our biggest webinars ever for that. We'll have ASC, MSC, B-Lab, Where Food Comes From, and that one is sponsored by Temper Pack as well. And then later in August, we have one all about secondary packaging, a topic that I have never really done any deep dive on, so I'm really happy to have B&B speak on that as well. We do have individual sponsorships available for our webinars, so if you are interested in getting involved with that, let us know as well. A few final announcements before we really get into it. We are going to be at Super Zoo in August. We have a happy hour, and we'll be recognize our top performers. So please join us there if you will be there as well. I also wanted to make sure that everyone knew that we have a PSC member LinkedIn group. This is a group only for member companies, but anyone at our member companies can join, and it's a space to collaborate and share knowledge and network, a more casual, informal way for our members to get to know each other. So we're really excited to see the membership on that grow. And I know a lot of you are wondering about our 2026 sponsorships. We will be announcing those later this month, and we're really excited about next year. We are actively in Plastic Recovery July. I know a lot of our members and partners have participated in that. We're so excited to actually be recovering plastic from nature with Repurpose Global. So we'll have a bigger share out on that at some point. And then I think most importantly for today, I wanted to have a few Zoom housekeeping notes. So there is a chat feature, and that's a great place to just say hello, where you're calling from, give a shout out, something that doesn't require a response. And then if you do have a question you would like to ask the panelists, please bop over to the Q&A feature, because that's what we will be looking at to facilitate the Q&A. I also wanted to call your attention to the little react button. Zoom is a little bit weird because we can't see your faces, but you can see ours. But if you find the react button, there should be a little clap or a heart that can give our panelists some love in the moment if you like what they are saying. Okay, enough with the announcements. Let's get into it. So I'm very excited to turn it over to our speakers, but I wanted to make sure that we kind of level set on some definitions that we need to know going into this. I could have picked that quote about you can't manage what you don't measure. I think that's it's very important because taking measurements is so important. But I actually really wanted to highlight this quote that's attributed to Albert Einstein. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. I find this quote super relevant to sustainability because so many really important parts of our work, like regenerative agriculture and biodiversity and carbon sequestration, they're difficult to measure exactly. And so what we're going to be talking about today is just like, how can we get accurate enough data to be actionable? And then a few quick definitions. We are going to be talking about life cycle assessments, or LCAs. That is a method of evaluating a bunch of different environmental impacts of a product service from cradle to grave, meaning from material extraction all the way through when it's done being used and disposed. We also have a mention of product carbon footprint, or a PCF. This is sort of similar to an LCA because it does look at the cradle to grave aspect, but it's really focused on carbon equivalents, measuring the greenhouse gas emissions from that product. And I also just wanted to plant a little seed of primary data versus secondary data. So primary data is when you have specific information collected directly from a source. And obviously that is a better way of having data if you can actually measure exactly what you're trying to get at. But secondary data is also important, and it consists of generalized or averaged information from databases or research. So when you don't have primary data, you can turn to secondary data, but there are some limitations with that. So that might be part of our discussion as well. Okay, so I have set the stage. And as I introduce our first speaker, we actually have a poll for you. So if we could launch that, we're curious to know just how familiar are you with regenerative agriculture? And your options are very familiar, somewhat familiar, or never heard of it. So feel free to type your answer or click your answer there. But our first speaker is Dr. Jennifer Adolphe. She's the Pet Technical Sales Manager at ADM Pet Nutrition. ADM is a company that manufactures pet nutrition products, all sorts of them. Jennifer has more than 20 years of experience in both human and animal nutrition, and in her current role, puts that experience to excellent use by providing technical support, nutrition training, formulation services, and new product development. She does a lot. And I've actually seen her speak multiple times in the last year at Pet Summit and at Pet Food Forum. And I absolutely always love what she has to say about data. I always learn so much. Plus, a quick fun fact about Jennifer is that she, over the weekend, ran a 5K with mud and with obstacles. And so I really hope that that went well. When I saw you before the webinar, it looks like you did wash off all the mud. So if you'll join me on screen, welcome.
All right, thanks so much, Allison. Yes, I survived the race and I've had a chance to clean up since then. It was a lot of fun. But yes, I'm here to speak with you about data-driven ingredients. So at ADM, sustainable practices and environmental responsibility are a really important part of the work that we do every day to serve our customers. Our sustainability strategy is organized into 3 focus areas. These are feed the world, protect nature, and enrich lives. So Allison alluded to the why, or the importance of data in sustainability. We need to support claims. There is a more strict regulatory environment emerging, and our customers are demanding that information be substantiated. And as she said, you really can't improve what you don't measure. So we've been focusing a lot on primary data. Overall, as a company, we have our Strive 35 targets, which represent our environmental footprint reduction goals and are a key priority at ADM. These targets span key impact areas: emissions, energy, water, and waste. And by setting these clear goals, we can assess where we are currently, define where we need to go, and then chart a path to get there. Regenerative agriculture is a key part of our sustainability program. This is defined as actively improving the land to restore and enhance natural resources like soil health, biodiversity, water, and climate resilience to create long-term benefits. Now, the great thing about Regen Ag is it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it's adapted to local conditions. The principles of Regen Ag are to maintain living roots in the soil, minimize soil disturbance, maximize biodiversity, keep bare soil covered, and responsibly manage inputs. It really creates a more resilient land, more resilient communities, improved soil health, healthier ecosystems, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Now, Regen Ag can provide a lot of data, and this data is really important for making decisions. So we have what's called a 9-box scorecard. It's a practical tool used to evaluate, track, and guide progress in implementing Regen Ag practices on farms. It really helps to simplify sustainability goals in an easy to understand visual format. It helps to assess the farm's practices, and the scorecard then supports decision making by identifying strengths, limitations, and improvement opportunities. A Regen Ag report also provides very detailed information about these various impact areas. So here I'm zooming into the effect of Regen Ag on carbon reduction. In this example, we can see that a decrease of 0.4 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per acre was sequestered on land that used cover crops. So this means that overall, on the total acreage, 8,700 metric tons of carbon was sequestered by these cover crops. So this really highlights how cover crops can help to reduce carbon. Another example of primary data that we have generated is through a life cycle assessment of one of our ingredients, which is Versity dried yeast. So we see here in scenario 2 that the product carbon footprint was 2.14 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram. And so this is a really important milestone. And we also did analysis with 3 other scenarios, with scenario 3 and 4 showing our ambitious plans to further reduce the carbon footprint of the ingredients produced in our Decatur, Illinois facilities over the next 5 years. So these plans include investments in a lower carbon power plant with post-combustion carbon capture and storage and more efficient energy sources. So we have this data for the current scenario, and then these additional improvements will further reduce the carbon footprint of Versity by as much as 77%. So again, it tells us where we are and where we're going. And then in addition, regenerative agriculture can further lower the potential product carbon footprint of Versity. And lastly, our premix facility in Effingham, Illinois has invested in renewable energy certificates, or RECs, as part of a strategy to lower the gate-to-gate carbon intensity of the plant. And so this means that all electricity used in the plant is covered by clean, renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. So another example of data being used to make sustainability decisions. And that's all I have, Allison.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'll give you a round of applause on behalf of everyone. That was great. I really love how you called out which was primary data. That was really helpful. All right, we will go on to our next speaker, but if you do have a question for Jennifer, please feel free to drop it in the chat. So we have another poll for you as I'm introducing our next speaker. Do you think customers trust environmental and sustainability data? Yes, no, or not sure. All right, so next we have May Walraven with InnovaFeed, which is a biotech company producing insects for animal nutrition. They brand their insect ingredients as Helucia, and if you want to know more about why they do that, please check out the white paper that ADM and InnovaFeed co-published recently, and we'll try to drop that in the chat for you as well. But May serves as a dual role at InnovaFeed, one as US General Manager, where she oversees deployment of ingredients in North America, and the other as Impact Chief Officer, where she is responsible for impact governance and strategy. She must really like that word impact because she's also part of InnovaFeed's impact committee and she leads the internal impact sponsors team. Wow. So today she's joining us from the south of France, I believe, and apparently her dog is absolutely loving it there, in part because there are donkeys to chase. So welcome, May.
Hi, Alison. Thank you. Yes, joining you from the south of France, and thank you for having me and hosting us today. So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about InnovaFeed because we're not as large and famous as ADM yet. But so at InnovaFeed, as Alison mentioned, we grow insects, and our vision was really to replace insects into their natural position in the food system so they could recycle low-value biomass or waste streams into the highest quality ingredients that we can then use to feed animals and ultimately feeding tomorrow's world. And so really at the DNA of our company is sustainability and how we can contribute to building a more circular, sustainable, and zero-waste agri-food chain. And so if you go to the next slide, we've actually built a sustainability strategy around what we call 4 cardinals, which are climate change, biodiversity, food security, and local social economic impact. These areas are where we believe we can actually have an impact, and yes, I like this word, beyond the boundaries of our company. So beyond improving our own footprint, how can we help our suppliers upstream as well as our customers downstream, and ultimately the whole value chain in making progress across these 4 dimensions. And data is very close to our heart, and so we've set objectives for 2030 that are quantitative in terms of how we want to deliver impact on these 4 cardinals, and every year we release in our impact report our progress against these targets. So as you can see on the climate change, we've actually gone a very long way in improving our impact in terms of the carbon footprint per ton of ingredient we produce. On the biodiversity and food security, these are directly connected to how many tons of ingredients we can produce each year, and we're currently ramping up our facilities, so that will accelerate over time. And if you go to the next slide, just a little bit of background on how we use data. So we have a very unique production model for our insects, which we refer to as industrial symbiosis, where we co-locate our insect farms with existing industries so that we can create as much circularity as possible and generate the maximum environmental and sustainability benefits. So here you see a photo of our factory in the north of France, where we're co-located with a wheat factory. And we use their byproducts to feed our insects with a pipeline you can see on the photo that's delivering directly those byproducts over the fence and avoiding about 120,000 trucks every year in logistics to deliver to the site. We also are co-located to a plant called Cogeban, which produces steam, and we are able to use the energy that they released to the atmosphere previously to heat our farm. And with that, we can save about 20,000 metric tons of CO2 every year. So the very first use of data that we have internally is to build the most optimized model for production and make it as environmentally friendly as possible. And that has an actual direct impact on the ingredients that we produce. So if you go to the next page, you can see that through this industrial symbiosis, we're about 80% lower to any other insect ingredients that would be produced without this co-location model. But these results are not achieved overnight. And so the second way we use data is to track our progress. And so on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see for our Helucia protein and our Helucia oil, every year we measure what the carbon footprint is per ton of ingredient. And at first we were operating a very large factory, but generating smaller volumes because we weren't fully ramped up. And so our impact was pretty high. But as we've ramped up our factory, you can see the intensity has significantly decreased, and we have a pretty clear line of sight to where we can get to in 2030 once we will be fully ramped up and our processes will be fully optimized. So I wanted to highlight here that we also have to think about data in a dynamic way, and data evolves over time, so we can use it to monitor progress. The next way we also use data is to compare the performance of our ingredient. And this can be tricky because there's a lot of aspects about the methodology that was used to generate the data. Also, the inventory step. So we've mentioned already primary versus secondary data. But there are efforts like the GFLI effort to harmonize some of that methodology and try to be able to compare apple versus apples. So as you can see here, our ingredients, where we are today versus where we expect to be in 2030, can be compared to existing sources of protein to assess how performant they are today and tomorrow. And then the next slide, I wanted to use a few minutes to highlight some of the challenges that we also are facing with data. And in particular, as a novel source of ingredient, we found that even though data is very precious, it can be hard to decide what data to trust or not. Today, as I mentioned, we're producing at industrial scales, but a lot of the LCA models that existed in the past were based on pilot scale. And so we often get feedback from customers or the market saying, well, we've seen that a kilo of insect protein is 7 kilos of CO2, and why are you communicating on 10% of that data? And the reason is, well, that was based on secondary data, and we're communicating on primary data. So it's important to keep in mind that the data can be different year over year, but also depending on what hypotheses have been used. And we are achieving very fast optimization in a very innovative space. So while some industries might see 5 to 10% improvement year over year, we're seeing our carbon footprint diminished by half every year. And so it's quite drastic changes that you will see in the environmental data that comes out of our industry. But again, this is not the track of everyone, and some players have decided to stay at a small size. So another issue is there is no standardized LCA results for some industries. I know some players would like to say, should we adopt insect protein? Yes or no? Well, it depends. Which actor are you considering? Which species of the insect? And I think, there is a need to get quite granular to understand the real impact of data. And then I think there is a real challenge in benchmarking. As I mentioned earlier, when you're comparing different environmental data, you really need to think of what's the purpose that you're using this data for, in order to be able to really do a fair comparison. When I think of novel ingredients, I think we're trying to supply a new source of protein or oil, and if you had to come up with additional volumes from existing technology, often it will have a much greater environmental impact that it has today. So if I think of soy, for instance, soy meal can be very efficient in terms of carbon footprint, but every additional volume that you want to create might lead to deforestation just because there isn't enough land anymore to create a soy meal. And so all of a sudden, are you comparing to the millions of tons of soy that are already being produced, or are you comparing to that additional ton that will need to be produced to meet future demand? So just wanted to finish on some of the challenges that we're facing, and very interested to hear if the audience has also been facing some of those challenges with data.
Bravo. Thank you, May. That was great. I love that you called out that data is both dynamic, so ever changing, kind of complicated, but then also the need to compare apples to apples. So hopefully we can talk about it later. We'll get into it. Okay. So our last speaker, we have one more poll for you while I introduce our third speaker. Do you use sustainability data and or LCAs to help you make decisions when purchasing ingredients? We're very curious to know. Well, welcome Dennis Tremorin. And thank you for being our final speaker today. Dennis is the Director of Sustainability for Pulse Canada. Pulses, in case you didn't know, are edible seeds from the legume family, and they include beans and peas and chickpeas and lentils, all that delicious stuff. And another fun fact is that Canada is one of the largest producers of the world, and the country exports 80% of the pulses it grows. Pulse Canada is the national association representing the growers, traders, and processors of Canadian pulses. And Dennis's role there is to quantify and communicate the environmental aspects of these crops. I learned also that Dennis has a 12-year-old Heinz 57 mutt, and that's the first time I heard that a dog described in that way, which sounds super adorable, and also I love ketchup. So I hope I get to see your dog someday, Dennis. Welcome.
Thank you very much. All right, so thanks, nice description, Allison. You stole some of my thunder around the wonderful things about pulses, but you did miss one thing, which is pulses are, as a legume, a nitrogen fixing crop, and they're really one of the cornerstones of our production system, especially in Western Canada, which have helped us diversify and produce more efficient cropping systems. So my background is in agronomy and soil science. This is kind of why I lived and breathed for a number of years out in the field. And then when you look at Western Canada, especially where we grow a lot of pulses, peas and lentils being the majority of the bulk of the volume that we produce, we see a production system that has actually aligned itself quite well with what we're calling regenerative agriculture today. I think 20 years ago, when farmers started to adopt a lot of these practices, it was probably 20 to 30 years ago, we were talking about regenerative agriculture. We were talking about reducing soil erosion. We were talking about increasing soil organic matter and increasing the amount of nutrient and water holding capacity we had in our soils, and just creating a more resilient system in the context of a system in a climate where it's quite arid. And we're talking about the prairies. You have recurring droughts. We also have a short growing season. You only have about 120 days to grow and harvest a crop. So all of these are risks that farmers have to deal with on a daily basis. But we really adapted our system away from growing a single crop towards something that has oil seeds and legumes into it now in a rotation. And also really adopting this no-till practice. Our farmers have adopted no-till, where we, across the entire cropping rotation, so for every crop that they're planting, it's harvested, there's no tillage involved, that we direct seed directly into the stubble to keep that soil protected. And that's really the principle of our system, is ensuring we keep that soil in place and ensure that we're really maintaining soil moisture, because that's the big risk of our system. And what we found is this system has actually improved the system quite a bit. What we don't see in our system is cover crops. So when we talk about regenerative agriculture, a lot of people talk about cover crops. It's a real challenge in our system because we don't have enough moisture to deal with. We can't have any more translocation of moisture into the air in that fall season. It really puts a risk, and it really adds risk to the system in a lot of contexts, depending on where you are. So again, regenerative agriculture is a hyper local aspect. And I think what we're seeing is our production system, if we go to the next slide, has shown that this adoption of these practices so far have actually created a lot of improvement. So soil organic matter, for example, and soil organic carbon, there's been a lot of sequestration on the prairies, for example. And this is data that's been produced from our federal agricultural agency in Canada called Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And really, if you look at soil erosion, if you look at soil organic carbon, if we look at nutrient and water retention, all of these things have increased and have created a more resilient system. We think of sequestration as pulling carbon out of the air, but farmers think about it as a means of having soils that are healthier and more robust and help them produce a crop, even in challenging conditions. So today, when we have a drought, farmers tend to get a yield that is much more respectable than they would have seen in 1975 or 1985 when our soils weren't as healthy. If we go to the next slide. And what I'm really trying to focus on is how do we capture this data? So we represent 25,000 farmers across Canada. We also represent over 100 processors and exporters. And how do we support our sector by creating strong secondary data sets that are representative of the sector? It's hard to create primary data for every producer and every supply chain out there, but how do we do this in a pre-competitive manner? So I've been focused on developing LCAs based on farmer survey. For the instance, this one based on peas and lentils, we surveyed over 600 farmers, and we try to capture data through those surveys that are pertinent to an LCA. So we've been able to publish life cycle assessments for peas, lentils, 3 types of dry beans, faba bean, and now chickpea we're just finalizing today. And the idea here is, can we capture not only the nitrogen fixing benefit of pulses and the fact that they're a low input crop inherently in the rotation, but also these other aspects which are important. So this no-till aspect of our production system, and also our climatic conditions which are pretty semi-arid and actually are a very important component of how much greenhouse gas emissions are produced from soils. These are the type of things that we need to start to capture within our secondary data sets in order to inform public repositories for data like the Global Feed Lifecycle Inventory, so GFLI, that was talked about earlier. So if we go to the next slide. And another piece of this is we want to use this, we want to show how this data can be utilized in systems as well. So we're ensuring we have secondary data sets, and then we're demonstrating to industry how they can utilize this data for different pertinent areas. So we have worked on food, for example, and cereal-based food applications with lentil flour, for example. And in this case, we worked on feed. So for swine, peas are actually a common feed ingredient in Western Canada for swine production. And they think there's actually more potential for their utilization in that market based on their sustainability benefits. Because they're nitrogen fixing crops and because of this production system, peas have a very low carbon footprint, for example. And when they displace other ingredients in the diet, being barley, wheat, or corn, they are able to replace some of that energy and protein in the diet and actually really lower the carbon footprint of that feed ingredient. This actually can be translated into the meat product as well. So for pork, we can see up to an 18% reduction in the carcass carbon footprint for pork. And if we go to the last slide I have here, we're trying to use this same principle of application to pet food now. So we're just starting some work with Dr. Nathan Peltier with the University of British Columbia. And we've been working with Dr. Kate Shevler from the University of Guelph on some example formulations of how pulses and pulse ingredients like pea protein concentrate can be used to reformulate pet foods like we've seen in the marketplace today. But more importantly, what's their role in helping to reduce environmental impacts of those, in this case, dry dog foods. And so we're really focusing on looking at things like whole pulse inclusion, like whole pea flour, and also pea protein ingredients, in this case, pea protein concentrate. And we're really looking at trying to see what's the full range of impact, to see what that to try to demonstrate that breadth of the potential applications and what the potential environmental impacts of those applications are. So in this case, we actually have a vegan formulation in our trial. And these results are coming where the assessment is ongoing today, and where we should have results to share in the fall of 2025. So that's all I had to say, Allison, and thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dennis. In hearing you talk, I realized the importance of secondary data. Like you said, you can't have every single farmer have primary data. So I love that we learned from May some of the stuff about primary data, and then from Dennis, maybe the benefit of secondary data. All right, so we have officially moved into our Q&A section. So I am going to actually stop sharing my screen and invite all of the panelists to come back on camera, since we are the stars of the show of this portion of the webinar. So for our audience, remember to click the Q&A if you have a question, and we will address those. We do have some support behind the scenes. If someone named Colton or Paula answers your question, they are with ADM and can type answers if we don't have time to get all of them today. All right, so as the audience is thinking of their questions, I actually wanted to start with one of my own. So collecting data just for the sake of having that data is really not the point. So I'm curious if each of you could just go in depth or share another example of exactly how a specific data point influenced a decision or led to a very specific outcome. Jennifer, I see you nodding. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure, my pleasure. We've had customers who require that data and wouldn't approve an ingredient without a product carbon footprint performed on the ingredient. And so that led us to do the full life cycle assessment, and then it resulted in the customer being able to decide if they would include that ingredient in their portfolio. And then I'd also like to invite Paula Labine to join me and talk a little bit about our regenerative agriculture program and some of that data that we provide to customers.
Welcome, Paula.
Jen, so another example, just a quick share. So Jen shared the 9 box. So, we collect from farmers 9 environmental data points. And when we aggregate that across a specific geography, that data can tell us a lot about where we and our customer partners need to redeploy resources, whether it's educational resources or financial resources, to improve practices or elevate practices in a certain area. So lots of data, but it's helping us decide what to do with that and how to best help farmers implement those practices.
Awesome. Thank you, Paula. Dennis or May, do you want to add anything else? Just an example of a specific outcome from data? May go.
I'll let May go first.
Sure. One specific example. So I mentioned that a lot of our energy is supplied by waste energy, but we still have about 40% that we have to produce. And we produce that steam using natural gas. And we looked into what would it cost versus what would it save in terms of CO2 emission to transfer from natural gas to biomethane. And from that, we were able to say, well, it's worth the investment of extra dollar per ton of protein to switch to biomethane. And so last year we actually switched our steam production from natural gas to biomethane, and that was a very data-driven decision.
Great. And Dennis, did you want to add to?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a couple of examples. I mean, one of the reasons why we've really focused on secondary data is we've had a number we've had a lot of growth in processing in North America. So our market has changed to a market that is requiring this type of data. And we've seen some of our own processors actually utilize this data and then add their own internal processing data to create outcomes for their own products. So it's been an outcome. Another thing is if we look at a crop like dry beans, for example, it's not a strong nitrogen fixer, and it's actually prompted some of our funding agencies and our provincial grower organizations to kind of take a second look at what can we actually look into our breeding programs and see if we can advance this crop towards being equivalent to these other legume crops like peas and lentils that don't require any nitrogen. So we'll go from there. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that I think about all the time, because I think about data when I wake up in the morning. How do we know when it's good enough? Because I understand that getting absolutely perfect data is really hard. So I'm curious how you balance spending the time and the money on data versus spending that time and money on actually making operational improvements. In other words, when is the data good enough to be actionable? And if I can throw in another layer, like when do you need a third party to review your data? And actually, I'm curious to start with you since you're collecting primary data.
Yeah, it's tough. And as I mentioned, I think data is dynamic, and so it's never good enough, but you can put in place some processes so that you can collect it more in a more automated way. So at this stage, we have all of our production data that automatically feed into all our sustainability models on a quarterly basis so that we can review how our carbon footprint and biodiversity impact is evolving over time. It does require quite a strong investment upstream to have that automation, but down the line you kind of have a lot of savings of not having to collect it manually. So I'd say if sustainability data is important, I would invest the upstream effort to automate that process. And then the auditing and validation of the data is a really good question, because everybody has different requirements in terms of what type of audit they want. Customers have their own audits. There are third parties like GFLI that can audit you. You can go to a private auditor, and so that's a really tough question. And we try to audit our data every 2 years when we've kind of made significant progress, and get a third party to validate it. But I think it really depends what you're using that data for, ultimately.
Totally. Dennis, I want to go to you next because I know you have a ton of experience with LCAs and you're working with aggregated data. So same question, when is the data good enough for you and when do you need it to be validated?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's extremely difficult and becoming more difficult to capture data from farmers via survey, for example. So it becomes a massive effort, and I think we're actually starting to exhaust our opportunities. The farmers are becoming less responsive over time to this, and so you really have to balance especially length of survey, what kind of information you're capturing, and make sure it's the most pertinent information and nothing extra. And there's a lot of decisions you have to make in terms of what data you have to leave out because it's not as relevant. It's not in the top pieces. But I do think what we're going to have to think about is more ways of capturing data that are already being produced by farmers, and making sure we can pull from those sources. So there's a lot of examples of agronomic tools and software that farmers utilize that if they could just click a button and say, yes, I'd like to share for this survey and automate that system is really the way that we can capture. There's a lot of pertinent information that's out there It's just making it easy for people to participate in something that they're already doing, is something that we'll have to do.
Yeah, lots of
So
trade-offs.
I have an example. So I'm the chair of an organization called Field to Market Canada, and that's a sister organization to Field to Market in the US. It's a great example of a set of tools that can be used for this purpose. And so, thanks.
Great. Jennifer, do you want to add anything to this question about validity and good enough?
Yeah, I think Dennis and May covered it really well. But I think that we don't want to end up in a situation where we have analysis paralysis, right? So starting somewhere is better than nothing. And I think that our Versity LCA is an example of that, where we didn't wait for the perfect scenario in order to get the data. And the benefit of that is that you also have the rationale and justification to do the work to move the projects forward to then further lower the carbon footprint. So this really demonstrates how continuous progress helps to drive measurable improvements in environmental impact.
Yeah. Actually, let's pull on that thread a little bit. There was a question in the chat about aligning with the Paris Agreement and setting targets. So maybe Jennifer, you can kind of continue that thought there and just say, like, how do you use data to set targets and work towards them?
Yeah, we did answer that question in the chat, so you can look at that as well. But we have a team that is able to do the analysis and gather the data in order to set targets. And then it's important to measure along the way, make sure that you're on progress to reach those targets and hopefully achieve them ahead of schedule, and then adjust and set new targets as you achieve the previous targets. So again, about continuous improvement and making sure you have the data to support decision making.
Great. And a quick reminder to the audience, we will have time for probably one more audience question. So if you have something, I just see one popped up, but if you would like to type in, please go ahead and do so. But May, did you want to comment on the question on data and using them for targets?
Yeah, I think the targets are difficult because you can base them as the Paris Agreement in terms of what the world needs to limit climate change, or you can base them on what you think you can do. And then there's a middle ground there. How do you find some, like, both the target that is useful for the planet, but that is also achievable, so you're not promising something you can't achieve? And I think in that respect, it's interesting to look at different solutions out there and which one offer the most potential for improvement. And I'd like to draw the parallel here a little bit with Moore's law that we used for semiconductors, and saying a solution might not be as good today, but its potential for improvement means that in 6 months, in 1 year, in 2 years, it will actually be tenfold better than what the current alternative is. And so I think targets are very important because they don't look at what you can do today, but they look at the potential that you can bring tomorrow. And so I think it's very important to have those targets and be ambitious with them.
I really like that model of balancing ambition to say, like, yeah, what does the world need sort of top down, and what can you actually do from a bottom up perspective? Dennis, did you want to add anything to targets?
Yeah, I have a couple of perspectives here off the top of my head. I think for us, a lot of targets we see it's almost basically our federal government or our provincial governments that set targets, and they'll look at agriculture as an opportunity, and we have to take a look at this from a perspective of, like, well, that's a federal government target, and we look to our academic institutions and our government counterparts on the research side to help us find new practices that can make improvements. But we're really focused on, and when it comes to farmers, it's our traditional focus is yield, resiliency, and sustainability comes because we want that system that's efficient at the end of the day, and it feeds into these concepts of targets for others. And then for pulses, I think that there's always whenever people talk about this, there's always an opportunity. We hear lots of companies say, we love pulses. There's such great solutions. We need more pulses in our rotations where we're sourcing our crops. But our answer to them is, well, you need to find ways for you to utilize our crops because that's where our gap is. It's CPG companies, pet food. We don't see a lot of North American use because it's not in those box products that we see on the shelf, and that would help. That helps everybody, basically.
Great. We did get a question in the Q&A. I see that Paula Labine is typing an answer. So maybe Dennis, in a few sentences, how would you encourage local growers and farmers to practice regenerative farming?
That is a good question. I don't think about it as encouraging farmers. I think about it the opposite way. Is how do you think about regenerative agriculture and the principles of it, which can support producers in their goals of achieving a more efficient production system, for example, or dealing with some of the challenges that they have. So I have an agroecology background, so it's somewhat very similar where you're thinking of this whole system and how do we make improvements to the system that align with the goals of the producer. So I would answer it that way, Allison.
Okay.
Yeah.
For anyone listening, I will read out Paula's answer. She says, educational support from agronomy experts that understand local conditions, and sometimes peer-to-peer farmer events, farmer testimonials are effective, and financial incentives. I know we could talk about that a lot longer, but I want to move to our closing because we're almost at an hour. So I would love each of you to just take a while to leave the audience with your final thoughts. Jennifer, would you like to go first?
Sure, thanks, Elson. My final thought is that the sustainability data is really a vital part of our mission and that it's the right thing to do for people, pets, and the planet. And it's really important to collaborate in order to develop the trust, transparency, and continuous improvement to drive that change.
Thank you. May, why don't you go next?
I can only align with Jennifer on the fact that data is critical to start the conversation and build trust and build collaborations. But there also needs to be a discussion around that data. Data alone is often hard to understand. It's dynamic, as I mentioned a few times. It depends on the hypothesis. So I think it's important that it becomes a conversation starter to find the right solutions together.
Thank you. And Dennis?
Yeah, I think I'll leave with, there's a real principle of when you're conducting this work, there's going to be a need for secondary data that is brought in. And if it makes a substantial part of your total environmental footprint, you really need to take a second look at the data source and ensure it has enough quality that it's representative geographically. Because we've seen a lot of generic data sets get it wrong. The weaker the generic data set, the higher the impacts tend to be because they're being cautious with the data. So really take a second look to see if there's additional data that's more specific to your supply chain is what I would recommend.
Great. What's coming to me, I'm going to give myself a chance to have closing thoughts, is just that everyone along the supply chain will have a different relationship with data. There are brands requesting it from ingredient suppliers and ingredient suppliers requesting it from primary producers, and people collecting it for their own use to set targets. So I guess in any case, data is really valuable and it takes time to collect and validate, and it's important. And so it's just really important to make sure it's actionable and that something is happening because of the data. We're not just doing it for data's sake. And of course, my biggest closing thought is just immense gratitude for all three of you. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise this morning. And thank you to our lovely audience for joining and filling out our polls and participating. I see the applause and the little emojis now. So thank you everyone so much and have a great rest of your day.